Marcus Thompson sat hunched over in the plastic chair, his hands trembling slightly as he pressed a blood-soaked towel against his left palm. The emergency room buzzed with activity around him, but he felt completely invisible. Nurses rushed past carrying charts and medications. Doctors called out medical terms he didn't understand. Families huddled together in worried clusters, whispering prayers and sharing tissues. But Marcus sat alone. The accident had happened so fast. One moment he was installing kitchen cabinets in the luxury home where he worked as a handyman. The next moment his saw had slipped, sending a jagged piece of wood straight through his palm. Blood had splattered across the marble countertops he'd spent hours protecting with drop cloths. The homeowners weren't there, of course. They never were when he worked. He was just another invisible service person in their world. He'd driven himself to the hospital, leaving a trail of blood drops on his truck's steering wheel. Now, 3 hours later, he was still waiting. The triage nurse had taken one look at his work clothes, paint-stained jeans, a faded t-shirt with holes, steel-toed boots that had seen better days, and told him to take a seat. That was at 2 p.m. The clock on the wall now showed 5:17 p.m. Marcus watched as people who arrived after him got called back first. A woman in a business suit with a minor cut on her finger. A teenager with his parents who had twisted his ankle playing tennis. An elderly man in expensive clothes who seemed to have nothing more than a cough. Each time a name was called, Marcus straightened up hopefully, only to slump back down when it wasn't his turn. The towel in his hand was now completely red. He'd asked the desk nurse twice if he could get a fresh one, but she'd barely looked up from her computer screen. "Someone will be with you shortly," she'd said both times, her voice flat and disinterested. Marcus wondered what shortly meant in hospital time. 4 hours, 5? Would he bleed to death in this waiting room before anyone noticed he was there? His phone had died an hour ago. Not that anyone would call anyway. His ex-wife had remarried 2 years ago and moved across the country with their daughter. His parents were both gone, and he'd never been good at making friends. Work was his life, and when the workday ended, he went home to his small apartment and watched television until he fell asleep in his recliner. The loneliness wasn't new, but somehow it felt sharper here in this crowded room, surrounded by people but completely invisible. He thought about his daughter Sarah, now 15 and probably not even remembering his phone number. When was the last time they'd talked? Christmas? Her birthday? The dates blurred together in a haze of missed connections and awkward conversations. A child started crying somewhere behind him, and Marcus heard gentle shushing sounds from what he assumed were the parents. He remembered doing that with Sarah when she was little, rocking her to sleep, reading bedtime stories, teaching her how to ride a bike. Those felt like memories from someone else's life now. The bleeding had slowed, but his hand throbbed with each heartbeat. Marcus worried about nerve damage. Would he still be able to work? Carpentry and handyman jobs required steady hands and strong grips. At 42, he wasn't young enough to start over in a new career, and he wasn't educated enough for office work. His hands were all he had. He looked around the waiting room again, taking in the faces. There was the businessman on his phone, probably closing deals while waiting for his minor ailment to be addressed. The soccer mom with her injured son, surrounded by other children and her husband who kept checking his expensive watch. The elderly couples who held hands and spoke in quiet, loving tones about doctor appointments and grandchildren's achievements. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere, to matter to someone. Marcus felt like a ghost among the living. The automatic doors slid open, letting in a gust of cold evening air. More people entered. A construction worker with a bandaged arm, a young mother carrying a feverish toddler, an elderly woman walking slowly with a cane. The construction worker looked around nervously, just like Marcus had hours earlier. He wanted to tell the man to prepare for a long wait, but he didn't have the energy for conversation. Marcus shifted in his chair, trying to find a position that didn't make his hand throb quite so much. The plastic seat had become uncomfortable hours ago, and his back ached from the awkward posture he'd adopted to keep pressure off his injured palm. He considered leaving, maybe trying the urgent care clinic across town, but he'd already invested so much time here. And urgent care might not handle something this serious anyway. A janitor mopped the floor nearby, and Marcus caught his eye. The man nodded slightly, one working person acknowledging another. It was the first human recognition Marcus had received all day, and it nearly brought tears to his eyes. Such a small gesture, but it reminded him that he was still visible to someone, even if that someone was just another person society tended to overlook. The PA system crackled to life, calling another name that wasn't his. Marcus closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the wall. Maybe this was just how life worked. Maybe some people mattered and others didn't. Maybe he'd been fooling himself all these years, thinking that hard work and kindness would be enough to earn him a place in the world. The towel in his hand was now completely soaked through, and small drops of blood were beginning to seep through onto his jeans. He knew he should ask for help again, but the desk nurse had made it clear that his needs weren't urgent. He was just another injured worker in a room full of people with better insurance and nicer clothes. As evening shadows began to fall outside the hospital windows, Marcus Thompson continued to wait, alone and invisible, wondering if anyone would ever see him as more than just another person taking up space in their world. The automatic doors whispered open again, and Marcus barely looked up. He'd stopped paying attention to new arrivals hours ago, but something made him glance toward the entrance anyway, perhaps the sudden quiet that seemed to settle over the immediate area. An elderly woman walked in with the kind of grace that couldn't be bought or learned. She moved slowly but deliberately, using a silver-handled walking cane that caught the fluorescent lights. Her gray hair was perfectly styled, swept back in an elegant chignon that probably cost more than Marcus made in a week. She wore a simple but obviously expensive black dress, pearls at her throat, and despite being well into her 70s, she carried herself like royalty. But it wasn't her obvious wealth that caught Marcus's attention. It was her eyes. As she surveyed the crowded waiting room, her gaze held something he hadn't expected to see from someone of her apparent status: genuine concern for everyone around her. Not the detached pity of someone doing charity work, but real, human compassion. She approached the registration desk, and Marcus couldn't help but overhear her conversation with the same nurse who had dismissed him hours earlier. The nurse's entire demeanor changed instantly, becoming respectful and attentive in a way that made Marcus's stomach tighten with familiar resentment. "Mrs. Whitmore," the nurse said, practically standing at attention, "we weren't expecting you today. Is everything all right?" "Just a minor issue, dear," the woman replied, her voice cultured but warm. "Nothing that can't wait." She glanced around the packed waiting room. "It looks quite busy today." "Oh yes, we're swamped. But don't worry, we'll get you right back." "Let me just call." "No need to rush," Mrs. Whitmore interrupted gently. "I can see there are people who've been waiting much longer than I have." Her eyes swept the room again, and for a brief moment they met Marcus's. He quickly looked away, embarrassed by his blood-soaked towel and disheveled appearance. The nurse seemed flustered by this response. Clearly, she was accustomed to VIP patients demanding immediate attention. "But Mrs. Whitmore, your time is valuable, and with your generous donations to the hospital—" "Everyone's time is valuable," the woman said firmly but kindly. "I'll wait my turn like everyone else." Marcus watched, amazed, as this clearly wealthy woman took a seat just 3 chairs away from him. She could have gone to any private clinic in the city. She could have demanded immediate attention and received it. Instead, she sat down with the same plastic chair and fluorescent lighting as everyone else. She pulled out a book from her small purse, something by Maya Angelou, and began to read. But Marcus noticed she kept glancing up at the other patients, particularly an exhausted-looking mother trying to keep 3 young children calm while waiting with what appeared to be a sick baby. After about 15 minutes, Mrs. Whitmore approached the young mother. "Excuse me, dear," she said softly. "Would it help if I entertained these little ones while you focus on your baby?" The mother looked up, surprised. "Oh, I couldn't ask you to—" "Nonsense. I'm just sitting here anyway, and I've raised children of my own." She smiled at the 2 older children, a boy about 6 and a girl maybe 4. "I bet you 2 know some good stories." What followed was remarkable. This elegant woman, dressed in what Marcus estimated was probably a $1,000 outfit, sat on the floor with the children. She told them stories about brave knights and clever princesses, making silly voices that had them giggling. She taught them hand games and helped them count the ceiling tiles. The mother visibly relaxed, able to focus on her feverish infant. Marcus found himself smiling for the first time all day as he watched the scene. The little boy was showing Mrs. Whitmore his scraped knee from a playground accident, and she was listening with the same serious attention she might give to a board meeting. The girl was braiding Mrs. Whitmore's fingers, chattering about her pet hamster. Other people in the waiting room began to notice too. The businessman put away his phone. The soccer family stopped their worried whispering and started smiling at the children's laughter. Even the teenagers looked up from their devices to watch this unexpected entertainment. But it was more than entertainment, Marcus realized. This woman was transforming the entire atmosphere of the room. The crushing loneliness he'd felt began to lift slightly, replaced by something he couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or just the reminder that kindness still existed in the world. When the mother's name was finally called, she tried to thank Mrs. Whitmore, who waved away the gratitude with genuine warmth. "It was my pleasure, dear. I hope the little one feels better soon." As the family disappeared behind the treatment doors, Mrs. Whitmore returned to her seat. She pulled out her book again, but seemed more focused on the people around her than the pages. Marcus watched her notice an elderly man struggling to fill out paperwork with arthritic hands. Without being asked, she offered to help him, patiently writing in his information while he dictated. She noticed the construction worker who'd arrived after Marcus, saw him wincing in pain, and quietly asked a passing nurse if he could get something for his discomfort. When the businessman started having what looked like an anxiety attack, she moved to sit beside him and spoke in low, calming tones until his breathing returned to normal. Each act of kindness was small, almost unnoticeable, but the cumulative effect was extraordinary. The waiting room began to feel less like a holding pen for the forgotten, and more like a community where people looked out for each other. Marcus found himself wondering about her story. Mrs. Whitmore, that's what the nurse had called her. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Clearly she was wealthy enough to command special treatment, but she chose to use her privilege differently. She saw people that others overlooked. She treated everyone with the same dignity and respect, regardless of their clothing or apparent social status. As he watched her help yet another person, this time an immigrant family, struggling with the registration forms in broken English, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt seen even though she hadn't spoken to him directly. Her presence in that room, her choice to treat everyone as worthy of attention and kindness, made him feel less invisible. For the first time since his accident, Marcus wasn't just focused on his throbbing hand or his frustration with the weight. He was thinking about what it meant to really see other people, to choose compassion over indifference. This elegant stranger was showing everyone in that room a different way to exist in the world, and Marcus found himself wanting to be part of it. Marcus had been watching Mrs. Whitmore for nearly an hour now, fascinated by her quiet acts of kindness. She seemed to have an invisible radar for people in need, moving from person to person like a gentle angel in expensive clothing. He'd never seen anything like it, especially not in a place where people were usually focused only on their own problems. He was so absorbed in observing her that he didn't notice when she stood up and began walking in his direction. It wasn't until her shadow fell across his lap that he looked up, startled to find her standing directly in front of him. "That looks quite painful," she said, nodding toward his blood-soaked towel. Her voice was soft but carried a strength that commanded attention. "How long have you been waiting?" Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment. Up close he could see the quality of her jewelry, the perfect manicure on her hands, the subtle makeup that spoke of professional application. He was acutely aware of his paint-stained clothes, his calloused hands, the smell of sawdust and sweat that probably clung to him despite his morning shower. "Oh, a few hours," he mumbled, trying to hide the extent of his injury. "It's not that bad." She tilted her head slightly, and Marcus saw something in her expression that surprised him. She wasn't looking at him with the polite but distant concern he'd expected. Instead, her eyes held the same genuine warmth he'd seen her offer to everyone else. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the chair beside him. Marcus nodded, too surprised to speak. This woman who clearly belonged in boardrooms and country clubs wanted to sit next to him. A working-class handyman who probably looked like he'd crawled out from under a truck. She settled into the plastic chair with the same grace she'd shown entering the hospital, as if it were a throne instead of uncomfortable emergency room furniture. For a moment they sat in companionable silence, and Marcus found himself relaxing slightly. "I'm Eleanor," she said simply, extending her hand. "Eleanor Whitmore." Marcus carefully shifted his injured hand to shake with his right. "Marcus Thompson." "Nice to meet you, ma'am." Just Eleanor, please. She smiled, and it transformed her entire face. What kind of work do you do, Marcus? The question was asked with genuine interest, not the polite but dismissive tone he usually heard from wealthy clients. I'm a handyman. Carpentry mostly. Some electrical work, plumbing repairs, that sort of thing. How wonderful, Eleanor said, and Marcus could tell she meant it. You create things with your hands. There's something very honest about that kind of work. Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest. When was the last time someone had called his work wonderful? Most people saw him as a necessary inconvenience, someone to fix their problems and disappear. What happened? Eleanor asked, gesturing to his injured hand. Saw slipped while I was installing cabinets. Stupid mistake. Marcus found himself talking more freely than he had with anyone in months. There was something about Eleanor that invited conversation, that made him feel like his words mattered. Accidents happen to everyone, she said. Even the most experienced craftsmen. My late husband was a surgeon, and I can't tell you how many times he came home with small cuts from his own tools. He used to say that anyone who worked with their hands long enough would eventually have scars to show for it. Your husband was a doctor? Yes, for 43 years. We met when I was a student nurse. Eleanor's voice grew soft with memory. He passed away 2 years ago. I'm sorry, Marcus said, meaning it. Despite only knowing her for a few minutes, he could already tell this woman had loved deeply and was still carrying that love. Thank you. He was a good man. He taught me that healing isn't just about medicine. Sometimes it's about really seeing people, acknowledging their worth. She looked around the waiting room. He would have been upset about how long you've been waiting. Marcus followed her gaze, suddenly seeing the room through different eyes. The way certain people got called back quickly while others, mostly those who looked like they couldn't afford premium insurance, continued to wait. He'd accepted it as just the way things were, but Eleanor's comment made him realize it didn't have to be. That's just how it is, he said with a shrug. People like me, we're used to waiting. Eleanor turned to look at him directly, and Marcus felt the full force of her attention. It was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, being truly seen by another human being, not judged or dismissed or categorized, but genuinely acknowledged. People like you, she repeated thoughtfully. And what kind of person do you think you are, Marcus? The question caught him off guard. It seemed simple enough, but somehow it felt loaded with meaning he couldn't quite grasp. I don't know. Just regular, I guess. Working class. Nothing special. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus worried he'd said something wrong. But when she spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. Do you know what I see when I look at you? She asked. Marcus shook his head, suddenly feeling like a student who hadn't studied for an important test. I see someone who builds things that last, someone who fixes what's broken, someone who uses his hands to make other people's lives better. She paused, and Marcus felt tears threatening behind his eyes. I see someone who came to work injured today because he has integrity, who drove himself to the hospital because he's independent and strong. I see someone who's been sitting here for hours without complaining because he's patient and considerate of others. No one had ever described him that way. Marcus felt something shifting inside him, like tectonic plates moving after being stuck for years. This woman, this stranger, saw things in him that he'd never seen in himself. Most people don't notice people like me, he said quietly. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the space between them. Then most people are missing out on something extraordinary. The words hit Marcus like a physical force. In that moment, sitting in a crowded emergency room with his hand throbbing and his clothes stained with blood, he felt more valued and visible than he had in years. This elegant woman, who could have had anything or anyone in the world, had chosen to sit with him, to really see him, to find worth in him that he'd forgotten existed. And then Eleanor said something that would change everything. Marcus sat there absorbing Eleanor's words, feeling something inside him that had been frozen for years beginning to thaw. No one had ever spoken to him the way she just had, with such genuine respect and recognition of his worth. He was still processing what she'd said when she leaned back in her chair and spoke again, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that seemed to cut through all the noise of the busy emergency room. You know, Marcus, she said, looking directly into his eyes, the world needs more people who care about doing things right, even when no one is watching. The sentence hung in the air between them, simple but profound. Marcus felt it settle into his chest like a warm stone, radiating heat through his entire body. Those words, even when no one is watching, touched something deep inside him that he'd never been able to articulate. All his life, he'd prided himself on his craftsmanship, on doing quality work whether the client was present or not. He'd always stayed late to sand that extra corner, to make sure the joint was perfect, to clean up every speck of sawdust. Not because anyone demanded it, but because it felt right. Because cutting corners, even invisible ones, felt like betraying something essential about who he was. But he'd never thought of it as valuable. He'd always assumed it was just what you were supposed to do, that everyone operated this way. The idea that this quality, this integrity that no one ever noticed, might actually be rare and precious was revolutionary to him. "How did you know?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the hospital noise. Eleanor smiled, and Marcus could see decades of wisdom in her expression. "Because I've been watching you for the past hour. The way you tried to clean up the blood drops you left on the floor when you first sat down. The way you moved your chair slightly so that elderly gentleman could get to his seat more easily. The way you've been careful not to drip on anyone else even though you're clearly in pain." Marcus hadn't realized he'd done any of those things consciously. They were just automatic responses, the way he'd been raised. The way he tried to move through the world without causing extra trouble for anyone. Most people are so focused on their own problems they don't notice the small courtesies, Eleanor continued. But I've learned that those small things, the way someone treats a space, how they consider others even when they're hurting, that tells you everything about their character. She paused, and Marcus felt her studying his face. "My husband and I spent our whole marriage looking for people like you. People who do the right thing when no one is looking. They're rarer than you might think." "People like me for what?" Marcus asked, confused. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider her words carefully. "Have you ever thought about what you might do if you had unlimited resources? If money wasn't a factor?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, but Marcus found himself thinking about it seriously. What would he do? "I guess I'd want to help people fix things. Not just cabinets and faucets, but bigger things. Like help families repair their homes who can't afford contractors. Maybe teach kids how to build things with their hands." "Why?" Eleanor asked simply. "Because..." Marcus struggled to put his feelings into words. "Because everyone deserves to have things that work properly, that are built to last. And because there's something special about creating something with your own hands, about knowing you made something better than it was before." Eleanor nodded, as if he'd just confirmed something she already knew. "My husband and I established a foundation before he died. We've been looking for the right person to run a very special program." Marcus felt his heart skip. "What kind of program?" "Teaching job skills to people who've fallen through the cracks. Ex-convicts trying to rebuild their lives. Kids aging out of foster care. Veterans struggling with the transition back to civilian life. People who just need someone to believe in them and give them practical skills they can use to build a future." The idea hit Marcus like a lightning bolt. All those people he'd seen over the years, the ones society wrote off, the ones who reminded him of himself in his darker moments, they could learn what he knew. They could discover the satisfaction of creating something lasting with their hands. "But I don't have any teaching experience," Marcus said, though his mind was already racing with possibilities. "Teaching experience can be learned," Eleanor replied. "Integrity can't be. Compassion can't be. The willingness to do excellent work even when no one is watching. That's either in someone's heart or it isn't." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was suggesting. "Why me? You don't even know me." Eleanor's expression grew serious, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Marcus, I've spent 76 years on this earth. I've met presidents and homeless people, celebrities and janitors, brilliant minds and simple hearts. And I can tell you that the measure of a person isn't their education or their bank account or their fame." She leaned forward slightly, and Marcus felt the full force of her conviction. The measure of a person is what they do when they think no one is watching, how they treat people who can't do anything for them. Whether they leave things better than they found them, even in small ways. She smiled. "You've been showing me exactly who you are for the past hour, Marcus. You're exactly what this world needs more of." Marcus felt tears threatening again. "But what if I'm not good enough? What if I let people down? Then you'll learn and do better next time," Eleanor said simply. "That's what good people do. They don't have to be perfect. They just have to care enough to keep trying." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, but instead of handing it to him immediately, she held it for a moment. This isn't charity, Marcus. This is opportunity. The foundation has been looking for someone with your exact combination of skills and character for over a year. We've interviewed dozens of candidates with impressive resumes and advanced degrees, but none of them had what you have. What's that? Marcus asked. Eleanor handed him the card, and as he took it with his uninjured hand, she delivered the words that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. The ability to see worth in forgotten people, because you understand what it feels like to be forgotten yourself. Marcus stared at the card through blurry eyes, unable to process that this was really happening. Eleanor Whitmore. He now remembered seeing her name in the newspaper, connected to various charitable causes, was offering him a chance to transform not just his own life, but the lives of others. Think about it, she said gently. There's no rush. But Marcus, people like you don't come along very often, and the world desperately needs what you have to offer. Marcus sat staring at the business card in his trembling hand, his mind reeling from everything Eleanor had said. The card was simple but elegant, cream-colored with raised lettering, the Whitmore Foundation for Second Chances. Below it was a phone number and an address in the nicest part of the city. Marcus Thompson? A nurse called from the doorway leading to the treatment area. Finally. After 6 hours of waiting, his name had been called. But now, suddenly, getting his hand treated seemed less important than this conversation with Eleanor. You should go, Eleanor said gently, noticing his hesitation. Get that hand properly taken care of. We can talk more later. Marcus stood slowly, his legs stiff from hours in the uncomfortable chair. Will you still be here when I get back? Eleanor smiled. I'll wait for you, Marcus. Take your time. As he walked toward the treatment area, Marcus felt like he was moving through a dream. The nurse led him to a small examination room, where a young doctor cleaned and examined his wound. The doctor was competent but rushed, clearly dealing with the backlog of patients who'd been waiting all day. You're lucky, the doctor said as he began stitching the deep cut. A few millimeters higher and you would have severed a tendon. As it is, you'll have full use of your hand once it heals. Marcus barely heard him. His mind was spinning with possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. Teaching people real skills they could use to build better lives. Working with people society had written off just like him. Being part of something that mattered, something that helped others find their own sense of worth and purpose. But doubt crept in as the adrenaline of the moment faded. What did he really know about running a program? He'd barely graduated high school. He'd never managed employees or dealt with budgets or written reports. How could someone like Eleanor Whitmore, who moved in circles of educated, sophisticated people, seriously consider him for such a responsibility? Maybe she was just being kind. Maybe this was how wealthy people talked to working-class folks, offering encouragement and false hope to make themselves feel better about the inequality they saw around them. Maybe by the time he got back to the waiting room, she'd be gone, and he'd be left with nothing but a business card and foolish dreams. All done, the doctor said, wrapping Marcus's hand in clean white bandages. Keep it dry for the next few days and come back in a week to have the stitches removed. Take these painkillers if you need them, but try not to use that hand for heavy work for at least 10 days. 10 days without work meant 10 days without income. Marcus thanked the doctor and made his way back to the waiting room, already calculating how he'd stretch his meager savings to cover rent and groceries. But Eleanor was still there, just as she'd promised. She was reading to a little girl whose parents were dealing with some kind of insurance issue at the front desk. When she saw Marcus, she finished the story, hugged the child gently, and stood to meet him. How do you feel? She asked, noticing his clean bandages. Better. Thank you for waiting. Marcus hesitated, then decided he had to ask the question that had been torturing him for the past hour. Are you serious about this job? I mean, really serious? Eleanor studied his face carefully. What's making you doubt it? Marcus looked down at his work boots, feeling foolish. I've been thinking, you don't really know anything about me. My background, my education, whether I'd even be good at something like this. Maybe you're just being nice because you felt sorry for me. Sit down, Eleanor said, her voice firm but kind. They returned to the same chairs they'd occupied before, and Eleanor turned to face him fully. Marcus, let me tell you something about my husband. Richard came from nothing. His father was a janitor, his mother cleaned houses. He got into medical school on scholarships and determination, working nights in a factory to pay for books and housing. When we met, he was wearing the same suit jacket he'd owned since high school, with patches on the elbows. She paused, lost in memory for a moment. The medical establishment didn't think much of him at first. Too rough around the edges, they said. Not polished enough for their tastes. But Richard became one of the most respected surgeons in the state, not because of his background, but because of his character. Because he never forgot what it felt like to struggle. So he treated every patient, rich or poor, with equal care and respect. Marcus listened intently, beginning to understand where she was going. When we started the foundation, we could have hired any number of highly credentialed professionals to run our programs. We interviewed dozens of them. They had impressive resumes, advanced degrees, smooth presentations. But you know what they didn't have? Marcus shook his head. They didn't have the lived experience of overcoming adversity. They couldn't relate to someone who'd been written off by society because they'd never been written off themselves. They couldn't truly understand the dignity that comes from honest work because most of them had never done work that left their hands dirty. Eleanor reached over and gently touched his bandaged hand. The people we want to help don't need another social worker with a master's degree telling them how to improve their lives. They need someone who's been where they are, someone who knows what it feels like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to wonder if you have any real value in this world. Marcus felt something click into place in his chest, like a lock finally opening after years of trying different keys. You said the world needs people who do the right thing when no one is watching, Eleanor continued. But it also needs people who can see the potential in others that society overlooks. And that requires someone who's been overlooked themselves. But what if I mess it up? Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor smiled. Then we'll figure it out together. Marcus, I didn't build a multi-million-dollar foundation by avoiding all risks. I built it by learning to recognize good people when I met them, and then trusting them to grow into their potential. She stood up and extended her hand to him. The question isn't whether you're qualified on paper. The question is, do you want to spend your life helping other people discover their own worth? Do you want to be part of something bigger than yourself? Marcus looked up at this remarkable woman who had somehow seen something in him that he'd never seen in himself. In her eyes, he didn't see pity or condescension. He saw respect, hope, and genuine belief in his potential. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a spark of excitement about the future. Not just his own future, but the possibility of touching other lives, of helping other forgotten people discover that they mattered too. He took her hand and stood up, feeling like he was stepping into a completely new version of himself. Yes, he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, I want to do that. 3 months later, Marcus stood in front of a renovated warehouse in the downtown area, keys trembling in his good hand as he unlocked the door to what would become the Whitmore Skills Center. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny possibilities waiting to take shape. The transformation had been incredible, almost surreal. After that day in the emergency room, Eleanor had moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to turning dreams into reality. Within a week, Marcus found himself sitting in a conference room with lawyers, accountants, and program coordinators, all of whom treated him not as Eleanor's charity case, but as their new colleague and leader. The learning curve had been steep. Marcus had spent countless evenings studying program management, reading about adult education techniques, and learning how to work with people from different backgrounds and circumstances. Eleanor had arranged for him to visit similar programs in other cities, to shadow experienced teachers, and to attend workshops on trauma-informed instruction. But the most profound education had come from the people he was meant to serve. Eleanor had introduced him to James, a former gang member trying to build a legitimate life for his young daughter. To Maria, a single mother who'd aged out of foster care and was living in her car. To Robert, a veteran whose PTSD made traditional employment difficult but whose hands remembered the mechanical skills he'd learned in the Army. Each person carried their own story of being overlooked, dismissed or forgotten by society, and each one reminded Marcus of himself in some fundamental way. They understood the weight of feeling invisible, the exhaustion of constantly proving their worth, the fear that maybe they really weren't capable of more than what others expected from them. The warehouse space reflected Eleanor's vision and Marcus's practical knowledge. One area was set up for woodworking, with professional-grade tools that made Marcus's old equipment look like toys. Another section focused on basic electrical work, plumbing, and home repair. There was a classroom area for learning business skills, resume writing, and job interview techniques. And in the center of it all was a common area where people could eat lunch together, share stories, and build the kind of community that many of them had never experienced. Marcus walked through the space slowly, running his fingers along the workbenches he'd helped design and build. In 2 hours, the first class would begin. 12 people had enrolled in the inaugural program, a mix of backgrounds and circumstances, but all united by their need for a second chance and someone willing to believe in their potential. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Thinking of you today. Remember, you were chosen for this moment. Trust yourself." Marcus smiled, pocketing the phone. Over the past 3 months, Eleanor had become more than just his benefactor. She'd become a mentor, a friend, and something like the mother figure he'd lost years ago. She'd taught him that leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about caring enough to help people find their own solutions. The first students began arriving early, just as Marcus had hoped they would. James came in wearing the work clothes Marcus had suggested he buy with his program stipend: clean jeans, steel-toed boots, a shirt without holes or stains. He looked nervous but determined. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," James said, the formality touching Marcus in ways he hadn't expected. "Just Marcus," he replied, shaking James's hand. "Ready to build something?" Maria arrived next, carrying a small backpack that Marcus knew contained everything she owned. She'd been staying in a transitional housing facility, but Marcus had helped her apply for a more permanent apartment that she'd move into once she found stable work. "I brought a notebook," she said shyly, pulling out a composition book that looked like it had cost her more than she could afford. "I want to write down everything I learn." One by one, the others arrived. Robert, who stood a little straighter than he had when Marcus first met him. Carmen, a young woman trying to rebuild after addiction, who'd been clean for 8 months and was terrified of disappointing anyone else. Derek, barely 18 and aging out of the foster system, who covered his fear with bravado, but whose eyes revealed his desperate hope for something better. Marcus looked around at their faces, eager, nervous, hopeful, scared, and saw himself reflected in each one. 6 months ago, he'd been the one sitting in a waiting room feeling invisible and forgotten. Now he was being trusted with these precious lives, these fragile hopes for transformation. "Okay," he said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. "Before we start learning how to build things, I want to tell you something important." The room grew quiet, and Marcus felt the weight of their attention. "I know some of you are here because a judge ordered it, or because it was your only option for housing assistance, or because someone told you this was your last chance. That's okay. I don't care why you're here. What I care about is what we do together while you're here." He walked over to one of the workbenches and picked up a piece of rough lumber. This piece of wood doesn't look like much right now. It's got rough edges, some cracks, maybe some knots that other people would see as flaws, but I can see what it could become with the right tools, the right techniques, and the right amount of care and attention. Marcus looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. "That's how I see each of you. Not as broken people who need fixing, but as people with incredible potential who just need the right tools and someone who believes in what you can become." He saw tears in Maria's eyes, watched James straighten his shoulders, noticed Robert nodding slowly. "We're going to start with basic carpentry today, but what we're really learning is much bigger than that. We're learning that we can create something beautiful and lasting with our hands. We're learning that we have value, that our work matters, that we deserve to take up space in this world." Marcus picked up a smooth plane and demonstrated how to shave thin curls from the rough board, revealing the beautiful grain underneath. Everyone deserves to discover what's possible when someone sees their potential and gives them the tools to develop it. And everyone deserves to learn what I learned just a few months ago, that the world needs people who care about doing things right, even when no one is watching. As the morning progressed and his students began working with the tools, learning to measure twice and cut once, feeling the satisfaction of creating something with their own hands, Marcus thought about Eleanor's words from that day in the emergency room. She'd been right about everything, but especially about this. The world did need more people who understood what it felt like to be forgotten, because those were the people who would never forget to see the worth in others. Looking around at his classroom full of second chances and new beginnings, Marcus finally understood what Eleanor had seen in him. It wasn't despite his struggles that he was qualified for this work. It was because of them. 1 year later, Marcus found himself back in the same emergency room where everything had changed. But this time he wasn't there as a patient. He was there with Derek, one of his first students, who had badly cut his hand while working on a furniture project for his new apartment. As they sat in the familiar waiting area, Marcus marveled at how different everything felt. The same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The same uncomfortable plastic chairs lined the walls. But now he saw the space through completely different eyes. Where once he'd seen only his own invisibility and abandonment, now he saw opportunities for connection and kindness. Derek sat beside him, nervous about the injury, but more worried about missing work at the custom furniture shop where he'd been employed for 6 months. The scared 18-year-old who'd first walked into Marcus's classroom had grown into a confident young craftsman with steady hands and an eye for detail. "It's going to be fine," Marcus assured him, remembering his own fears about hand injuries and their impact on his ability to work. "Even if you need a few stitches, it won't affect your skills." "I know," Derek said, then grinned. "Besides, you taught me that scars just prove you're not afraid to work hard." Marcus smiled, recognizing his own words reflected back at him. Over the past year, he'd watched 12 people transform their lives through the program. James had started his own small contracting business and was saving money to buy a house for his daughter. Maria had not only found stable housing, but had enrolled in community college to study social work, wanting to help others the way she'd been helped. Robert had discovered that working with his hands calmed his anxiety better than any medication, and he'd become Marcus's assistant instructor. The program's success had exceeded everyone's expectations, including Eleanor's. They'd received funding to expand, to serve more people, to add additional skill tracks beyond carpentry. Marcus had been invited to speak at conferences, to share his story with other organizations trying to help forgotten populations. But the real measure of success wasn't in the statistics or the funding. It was in moments like this, sitting with Derek and seeing the confidence and hope that had replaced the fear and desperation. "Marcus Thompson?" a familiar voice called. Marcus looked up to see the same nurse who had dismissed him so coldly a year ago. She approached them with a smile that seemed genuine, though Marcus couldn't be sure if she remembered him. "The doctor can see your friend now," she said, then paused, studying Marcus's face. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" "I was here about a year ago," Marcus said simply. "Similar injury." Recognition dawned in her eyes, and Marcus saw something that surprised him: embarrassment. "Oh, yes, I remember. I'm sorry about how long you had to wait that day. We were extremely busy," and she trailed off, probably realizing that busyness didn't excuse the way she'd treated him. "It's okay," Marcus said, and meant it. Sometimes the worst experiences lead to the best opportunities. As Derek was called back for treatment, Marcus settled in to wait. But instead of feeling forgotten and invisible, he found himself doing what Eleanor had done that day, really seeing the people around him. There was a construction worker with a bandaged arm, looking tired and worried. A young mother trying to keep her feverish toddler calm. An elderly man struggling to fill out paperwork with shaky hands. All the same types of people who'd been there a year ago, all carrying the same weight of feeling overlooked by a world that seemed to value them only for what they could produce. Without thinking about it, Marcus stood up and approached the elderly man. "Can I help you with those forms?" The man looked up gratefully. "These new insurance papers are so confusing. I can't read the small print like I used to." As Marcus helped him fill out the information, he thought about the ripple effects of kindness. Eleanor's compassion toward him had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who'd come through his program. And now those people were out in the world, treating others with the same dignity and respect they'd learned to give themselves. After helping the elderly man, Marcus noticed the construction worker wincing in pain. He remembered that feeling, the way physical discomfort was made worse by the stress of lost work time and medical bills. "First time here?" Marcus asked, taking the seat beside him. The man nodded. "Cut myself on some rebar. Probably need stitches." He looked around the busy waiting room. "Looks like it's going to be a long wait." "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But sometimes the waiting is worth it." Sometimes you meet exactly the person you need to meet. Over the next hour, as they waited for Derek to finish his treatment, Marcus found himself in conversation with several people. He listened to their stories, offered encouragement, and in a few cases mentioned the skills program for those who seemed like they might benefit from it. He wasn't recruiting. He was simply doing what Eleanor had taught him, seeing people who often went unseen and acknowledging their worth. When Derek emerged with his hand properly bandaged and a prescription for antibiotics, he found Marcus surrounded by a small group of people who were laughing at something he'd said. "Ready to go?" Derek asked, amused by the scene. As they walked toward the exit, Derek shook his head in amazement. "Man, you really can't go anywhere without collecting people, can you?" Marcus chuckled. "I learned from the best." Outside in the parking lot, Derek paused before getting into his car. "You know what's funny? A year ago, I was convinced the whole world was against people like me, that nobody cared what happened to kids aging out of foster care. What changed your mind?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Meeting you, seeing that there were people who cared enough to invest in someone they barely knew, learning that my life could be about more than just surviving." Derek gestured back toward the hospital. "And now look at you, doing the same thing for total strangers in a waiting room." As Marcus drove home that evening, he thought about the year that had passed since his own emergency room visit. He thought about Eleanor, who continued to be a mentor and friend who had recently announced her intention to fund 5 more skills centers in other cities. He thought about his students, past, present, and future, and the chain reaction of transformation that happened when people were given tools, training, and most importantly, the message that they mattered. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. It was his daughter Sarah calling from college where she was studying education. Their relationship had slowly rebuilt over the past year, as Marcus had become someone with purpose and hope to share. "Hi, Dad," she said, and Marcus still felt a thrill at hearing genuine warmth in her voice. "How was your day?" "Good," Marcus said, thinking about Derek's injury, the people in the waiting room, the way kindness seemed to multiply when you weren't afraid to offer it. "Really good, actually. How about yours?" As they talked about her classes, her plans for the future, and his work at the center, Marcus realized that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all his life without even knowing it. Not just meaningful work or financial security, but a sense of purpose that connected him to something larger than himself. Eleanor had been right about everything, but especially about this. The world did need people who understood what it felt like to be forgotten. Because those were the people who would remember to see everyone else, who would never stop believing that every person they met had the potential to become something extraordinary. And sometimes, all it took was one person willing to sit down beside you and really see who you could become.